On the afternoon of January 29, 1945, in a frozen Belgian farmhouse outside the village of Holzheim, a 5'5" American paratrooper stood surrounded by 80 armed German soldiers. First Sergeant Leonard Funk had been fighting without pause for 7 months. He weighed 130 pounds soaking wet, carried a Thompson submachine gun that weighed almost 11 pounds loaded, and had just walked into what should have been his execution. In the next 45 seconds, he would make a decision so calculated, so violent, and so tactically precise that it would reshape how the United States military trains soldiers to think under catastrophic pressure. This is not a story about fearlessness. This is a story about what happens when fear becomes fuel. Leonard Anthony Funk Jr. was born in Braddock, Pennsylvania on August 19, 1916, into a world that did not yet know what mechanized warfare meant. Braddock was steel country, mill country, a place where men worked blast furnaces and came home with burns and exhaustion etched into their faces. The smell of molten iron hung over the town like weather. Funk grew up small in a landscape of industrial giants, watching men twice his size haul tonnage he could never dream of moving. But smallness in Braddock did not mean weakness. It meant you learned to be faster, smarter, more stubborn than the world expected. You learned to make decisions that mattered, because hesitation in a steel mill could cost you a hand, an arm, a life. Funk carried that lesson into everything he did. When he enlisted in the United States Army in 1942, Funk was already 25 years old, older than most of the teenagers flooding into recruiting stations across the country. He was married. He had worked. He understood consequence in a way that 18-year-olds with fresh faces and no scars did not. The Army looked at his height and his age and his background and sent him to the Paratroopers anyway, because by 1942 the standards had shifted. If you were willing to jump out of an airplane into enemy fire, the Army would teach you how. Funk volunteered for the 82nd Airborne Division, a unit that was still writing its own mythology in real time. Airborne was not about size. It was about whether you would go when the light turned green and the door opened and the night rushed in at 120 miles per hour. The 82nd Airborne had been reactivated in March of 1942 as one of the first American paratrooper divisions. It drew men from everywhere, city boys and farm boys, men who had never seen an airplane up close and men who thought jumping out of one sounded like the most American thing they could possibly do. Training was Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where the sand was deep and the humidity made every movement feel like pushing through wet concrete. You ran with full packs. You jumped from 34-foot towers until your ankles learned to absorb impact. You packed your own parachute because if it did not open, there was no one else to blame. You learned to land, roll, gather your silk, strip your reserve, and move toward the objective while your heart was still hammering in your chest. Most importantly, you learned that airborne soldiers do not retreat. There is no fallback position when you have been dropped 15 miles behind enemy lines. You hold, or you die holding. Funk made sergeant quickly, then staff sergeant, then first sergeant of Company C, 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment. First sergeant is not a rank you get for being loud or aggressive. It is the rank you earn when officers trust you to hold their unit together when everything falls apart, when communication fails, when the plan disintegrates on contact with the enemy. A first sergeant is the backbone of a rifle company. He knows every man by name, knows who can be pushed and who is already at the edge, knows which corporal has a wife waiting at home, and which private is one firefight away from cracking. Funk was that man for Company C. He was older than most of them, smaller than most of them, and tougher than any of them had ever imagined possible. The 82nd Airborne Division deployed to Europe in the spring of 1943, staging in Northern Ireland and then England, preparing for an invasion that everyone knew was coming but no one could predict. The rumor mill ran constantly. France, Norway, Holland, the Mediterranean. Every day brought new speculation and every night brought the same reality, packing gear, checking weapons, drilling until muscle memory replaced thought. Funk spent those months turning Company C into something that could survive what was ahead. He ran them through live fire exercises. He made them practice assembly in the dark, because when you jump at night, you hit the ground alone and scattered, and you have exactly 15 minutes to become a unit again before the enemy finds you. He checked their weapons personally, because a rifle that jams in combat is a death sentence. He did not tell them they would be fine. He told them what to do when they were not fine. On June 6, 1944, Operation Overlord began. The 82nd Airborne jumped into Normandy in the hours before dawn, dropping into a darkness so complete that men could not see their own hands in front of their faces. The drop was chaos. Planes scattered by anti-aircraft fire, paratroopers thrown off course by wind and evasive maneuvers, silk canopies tangling in hedgerows and telephone lines, and the flooded fields that the Germans had deliberately inundated. Funk landed hard in an apple orchard south of St. Mir-Eglise, felt the shock run through his boots and knees and spine, rolled, came up with his Thompson ready. He could hear gunfire in every direction. Small arms, machine guns, the distant crump of artillery. He had no idea where he was. He had no idea where his company was. He knew his mission, and he started walking toward it. Normandy was hedgerows. Ancient earthen walls topped with vegetation so thick that you could not see 10 feet in any direction. Fields carved into a maze that turned every advance into a close-range knife fight. The Germans used the hedgerows like fortifications, setting up machine gun positions at crossroads, waiting for American infantry to push through the narrow gaps where they could be cut down in seconds. The 82nd fought for every field, every farmhouse, every crossroads. Funk led his men through that nightmare for 33 days. They moved at night when they could, because daylight meant German observers with radios calling in artillery. They learned to recognize the sound of an 88mm gun, the flat crack that meant you had 2 seconds to get down before the shell arrived. They learned to navigate by compass and dead reckoning, because maps meant nothing when you could not see the terrain. They learned that the smell of death does not fade, that it gets into your uniform and your skin and your lungs until you stop noticing it. Funk did not think of himself as brave. He thought of himself as responsible. Company C depended on him to make decisions that kept them alive, and so he made those decisions every hour of every day for 33 days straight. When to advance, when to hold, which hedgerow to clear next, which man to send forward as point. He knew that every choice carried weight, that telling a soldier to move meant you might be ordering his death, and he carried that weight without showing it, because his men needed to believe their first sergeant knew what he was doing. Bravery is easy when you have nothing to lose. Leadership is harder when you are responsible for 200 lives, and you know that some of them will not make it home. After Normandy came England again, briefly, a few weeks to absorb replacements and repair equipment and sleep for more than 2 hours at a time. Then came Operation Market Garden in September of 1944, the plan to drop 3 airborne divisions into Holland, seize bridges across the Rhine, and end the war by Christmas. It was the largest airborne operation in history, and it was a disaster. The 82nd jumped into Nijmegen and fought for 9 days in urban combat, street by street, house by house. They took the bridge. They held the bridge. They watched the British paratroopers at Arnhem get destroyed because the ground forces could not reach them in time. Funk led Company C through Nijmegen with the same relentless focus he had shown in Normandy, moving through rubble and fire, coordinating with tanks, calling in artillery, keeping his men alive while the operation crumbled around them. The months that followed were attrition. The 82nd was pulled off the line, sent back to France, refitted, and then deployed to the Hürtgen forest in November. The Hürtgen was trees and mud and cold rain, a meat grinder where entire battalions vanished into the woods and came out as scattered remnants. Visibility was 50 feet on a good day. German artillery had every trail and clearing pre-sighted. The forest floor was a tangle of roots and shell holes that turned every movement into a stumbling exhaustion. Funk and his men spent weeks in the Hürtgen, patrolling, probing, holding defensive positions that barely qualified as positions. They were wet constantly. Their boots rotted. Trench foot became epidemic. Men stopped talking unless they had to, because talking required energy they did not have. By December of 1944, Company C had been in combat for 6 months straight. They had jumped twice, fought through France and Holland and Germany, lost men and replaced them and lost the replacements. Funk himself had been promoted to First Sergeant permanently, a field promotion that recognized what everyone already knew, that he was the reason Company C still functioned. He had stopped counting days. He had stopped thinking about home. He focused on the next objective, the next patrol, the next watch rotation. That was how you survived. You did not look ahead and you did not look back. You stayed in the present and you made the decisions the present required. Then came December 16, 1944, and the Germans launched the largest counteroffensive of the Western Front. 3 armies, 30 divisions, 250,000 men smashing into the weakest part of the American line in the Ardennes. The goal was to split the Allied forces, retake Antwerp, force a negotiated peace before the Russians reached Berlin. It was desperation turned into strategy, one final gamble with everything Hitler had left. The offensive punched a 50-mile bulge into the American lines in the first 72 hours, overrunning entire regiments, capturing thousands of prisoners, creating chaos that rippled all the way back to Paris. The weather was brutal. Heavy snow, freezing fog, temperatures that dropped below zero at night. German tanks moved through the Ardennes like ghosts, appearing out of the mist, destroying supply convoys, encircling strongpoints. The 82nd Airborne was trucked north from France in a convoy that moved through snow and ice, and roads clogged with refugees fleeing west. They deployed into Belgium on December 20th, moving into defensive positions around the towns of Trois-Ponts and Vielsalm and Werbemont. Company C dug in on high ground overlooking approach routes. The Germans needed to keep pushing west. Funk spent the first days establishing fields of fire, positioning machine guns, coordinating with adjacent units. The snow was 3 feet deep in places. Digging foxholes meant breaking through frozen earth with entrenching tools that rang like bells against the ice. Men rotated in and out of positions every 2 hours because longer than that and you risked hypothermia. They had no winter uniforms, just their standard wool, and whatever they could scavenge from abandoned farmhouses. Funk wore 2 pairs of socks, changed them every day, and still felt his toes go numb every night. The fighting in the Ardennes was not like Normandy or Holland. It was smaller, more isolated, platoons and squads holding against German probes, calling in artillery when they could, pulling back when they had to. Visibility was almost zero. Snow reduced everything to shapes and movement, friend and enemy equally obscured. The Germans had winter camouflage white smocks over their uniforms that made them invisible until they were close enough to kill. American soldiers fought without that advantage, dark green against white snow, targets that stood out at 200 yards. Funk adapted. He kept his men in buildings when possible, basements and barns where they could watch approaches without exposing themselves. He sent out patrols at dawn and dusk when the light was worst, when everyone was equally blind. He learned to trust sound over sight, the crunch of snow under boots, the metallic click of a rifle bolt, the hiss of incoming mortar rounds. By mid-January of 1945, the German offensive had stalled. They had pushed 40 miles west but had not taken the key road junctions, had not broken through to Antwerp, had not forced the collapse they needed. The weather began to clear. Allied air power returned, bombing German supply lines, strafing tank columns. The 82nd transitioned from defense to offense, pushing east, retaking ground that had been lost in December. Company C moved forward through snow that was now churned into frozen mud by weeks of vehicle traffic. They cleared villages, one house at a time, tossing grenades into cellars, checking attics, moving with the slow, methodical rhythm of men who knew that rushing got you killed. Holzheim was a farming village, maybe 30 buildings clustered around a crossroads. It had changed hands twice already, American units pushing through, German units counterattacking, civilians hiding in basements while the fighting surged back and forth overhead. On January 29th, Company C took Holzheim for the third time, pushing out a small German rearguard, securing the buildings, setting up defensive positions. Funk led a patrol through the village, checking for stragglers, clearing barns, making sure they were not going to get ambushed by soldiers hiding in haystacks. Everything seemed quiet. Then one of his men found the farmhouse on the eastern edge of town. The farmhouse was stone, 2 stories, with a barn attached and a courtyard partially enclosed by a low wall. It was the kind of structure that farmers used for generations. Thick walls that kept heat in winter and cool in summer, small windows that limited drafts. When Funk's patrol approached, they found 4 American soldiers standing in the courtyard with their hands up. Behind them, through the farmhouse door, 80 German soldiers stood in formation, disarmed, their weapons stacked against the wall under guard. It should have been a prisoner processing detail. It was about to become something else. Funk entered the courtyard with his Thompson slung across his chest, muzzle down, ready but not raised. He had carried that Thompson for 7 months, a model M1942-01, a variant designed for paratroopers with a horizontal foregrip and a collapsible stock. It fired 450 caliber rounds per minute, fed from either a 20-round box magazine or a 50-round drum. Funk preferred the box magazines, lighter, more reliable, less prone to jamming. The weapon weighed 10.8 pounds with a full magazine. At close range it was devastating. At long range it was nearly useless, effective to maybe 50 yards, accurate to half that. Funk knew its capabilities intimately. He had fired thousands of rounds through it in training and combat. He knew the recoil pattern, the way the muzzle climbed after the third shot, the slight tendency to pull left under sustained fire. He knew how to clear a jam in under 5 seconds and how to change magazines without looking. The Thompson was not a precision weapon. It was a room-clearing tool, designed for the kind of fighting paratroopers did, close quarters, fast-moving, decisive. The situation in the courtyard was wrong. Funk saw it immediately. 4 American guards, young soldiers, probably replacements who had not been with the division long enough to develop the instincts that kept you alive. 80 German prisoners, too calm, too organized, standing in formation like they were waiting for orders. And then Funk saw why. The guards had left the German weapons too close, close enough that a man could take 3 steps and pick up a rifle. Close enough that this was not a secure prisoner-holding area, but a tactical mistake waiting to become a massacre. Before Funk could react, the German prisoners moved. It was coordinated, rehearsed, executed with the kind of precision that comes from professional soldiers who have trained together. 20 men broke formation simultaneously, moving toward the weapon stacks. The 4 American guards tried to respond, but they were overwhelmed in seconds, disarmed, forced to the ground, replaced by Germans who picked up Mauser rifles and turned them on the rest of the courtyard. The entire reversal took less than 10 seconds. One moment Funk was looking at prisoners. The next moment he was looking at 80 armed enemy soldiers, and he was alone. A German officer stepped forward from the farmhouse door, an Oberleutnant, equivalent to an American first lieutenant. He wore a winter field uniform, clean compared to the mud and blood-stained gear most soldiers wore by late January. He carried a Walther pistol in his right hand, barrel leveled at Funk's chest from 15 feet away. The officer spoke in German, then in heavily accented English, telling Funk to drop his weapon, to surrender, that he was surrounded and had no chance. The mathematics were obvious. 80 armed men against 1, 4 hostages on the ground, no cover, no support. The tactical situation was hopeless. The correct decision by every standard of military logic was to surrender. Preserve your own life, avoid getting the hostages killed, except that sometimes you lose. Funk looked at the German officer. He looked at the 80 soldiers forming a loose semicircle around the courtyard, rifles ready but not yet aimed with lethal precision. He looked at his 4 men on the ground, terrified but alive. He understood that this moment was a hinge, that what happened in the next few seconds would determine whether Company C held Holzheim or whether the Germans retook it, whether his men lived or died, whether the tactical advantage they had fought for all month would evaporate because of one mistake in one farmhouse. And he understood something else. The German officer was making the same mistake the guards had made. He was assuming surrender was inevitable. He was assuming that a 5'5" American first sergeant surrounded by 80 soldiers would do the logical thing. Funk raised his hands. He let the Thompson hang from its sling, muzzle pointing at the ground. He took one step forward as if complying, as if accepting the officer's terms. The German officer relaxed slightly, lowered his pistol a fraction of an inch, started to turn toward his men to give the order to secure the new prisoner. And in that moment, in the half-second when the officer's attention shifted, Funk grabbed the Thompson, thumbed the safety off, brought the weapon up in a single motion that was faster than thought, and opened fire. The Thompson bucked against Funk's shoulder, the stock digging into the hollow beneath his collarbone. The muzzle climbed and he forced it down, controlled the recoil with his left hand on the foregrip, squeezed the trigger in short bursts, 2-3 round bursts, 4-5. The sound in the enclosed courtyard was shattering, the high-pitched crack of 45 caliber rounds supersonic, echoing off stone walls, overlapping into a continuous roar. Funk fired at the German officer first, center mass, 3 rounds that punched through the man's chest before he could raise his pistol. The officer went down instantly, dead or dying, his weapon unfired. Funk transitioned to the nearest group of soldiers, the men who had rearmed themselves, who were the immediate threat. He swept the Thompson left to right, firing in controlled bursts, aiming for center mass because there was no time for precision. Men fell. Men scattered. Some tried to bring their rifles up and died before they could acquire a target. Some tried to run and were hit in the back as they turned. The magazine ran dry. 20 rounds gone in approximately 4 seconds. Funk dropped into a crouch, his hands moving with trained speed, ejecting the empty magazine, pulling a fresh one from the pouch on his belt, seating it with a hard slap, charging the bolt. The entire reload took 3 seconds. Around him, the courtyard was chaos. German soldiers diving for cover behind the low wall, others dropping their weapons and raising their hands, others trying to return fire with rifles they had just picked up, still working the bolts, still chambering rounds. Funk came up from his crouch and fired again, another burst, another, methodically eliminating threats in order of proximity. The 2 soldiers behind the wall, the man raising a Mauser at the barn door, the cluster of 3 trying to use the farmhouse corner for cover. The 4 American guards recovered. They scrambled for the stacked German weapons, grabbed rifles, started firing at the edges of the crowd, providing covering fire that kept the Germans disorganized. Other American soldiers appeared at the courtyard entrance, drawn by the sound of sustained gunfire, adding their rifles to the fight. What had been an execution was now a battle, and the Germans were caught in the open, disorganized, leaderless, facing trained paratroopers who had been fighting for 7 months and knew exactly what to do in close quarters combat. Funk's second magazine ran dry. He reloaded again, faster now, muscle memory overriding conscious thought. The courtyard was smoke and noise and bodies on the ground, wounded men screaming, others silent. The smell of cordite was overwhelming, the bitter chemical tang of burned gunpowder mixing with the iron scent of blood. Funk's ears were ringing, the high-pitched whine of acoustic trauma that would last for hours. He could not hear individual sounds anymore, just a generalized roar punctuated by the flat crack of rifle shots. He swept the courtyard with his eyes, looking for threats, finding fewer with each passing second. The Germans were breaking. Those who could were throwing down their weapons and raising their hands. Those who could not were on the ground, dead or wounded or too shocked to move. The shooting stopped. Funk stood in the center of the courtyard, Thompson raised, breathing hard, his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. Around him, 21 German soldiers lay dead. 24 were wounded, some seriously, compound fractures and sucking chest wounds and arterial bleeding that required immediate tourniquets. The rest had surrendered, hands up, faces pale, the fight completely gone from them. The 4 American guards were alive, shaken but unhurt. Company C held Holzheim. The German counterattack had failed before it started. The entire engagement had lasted 45 seconds from the moment Funk raised his hands to the moment the last shot was fired. 45 seconds of violence, so compressed and intense that men who witnessed it would struggle to describe it coherently for the rest of their lives. Some would say Funk fired from the hip. Some would say he moved like lightning. Some would say it was the bravest thing they had ever seen. What actually happened was simpler and more terrifying. Funk had calculated the odds, decided that surrender meant losing the village and possibly losing his men, and chosen violence as the tactically correct option. He had executed that choice with the weapon skills and combat experience of a soldier who had been fighting for 7 months without pause. He had won not because he was fearless, but because he was more afraid of failure than of death. The aftermath was immediate and administrative. The wounded Germans were treated by American medics, the dead were removed from the courtyard, the prisoners were secured properly this time with guards who understood what proper meant. Funk's company commander arrived within minutes, assessed the situation, called it into battalion. The report went up the chain of command, officer to officer, until it reached division headquarters and then corps and then army. By nightfall, everyone in the 82nd Airborne knew what First Sergeant Funk had done. By the next day, officers were talking about it as a case study in close quarters combat. By the next week, it was being used in training scenarios at replacement depots in England and France. The Medal of Honor citation would come later, months later, after the war in Europe had ended and the paperwork had been processed and verified by witnesses, and approved at every level of command. President Harry Truman would present the medal to Funk in a ceremony at the White House, shaking his hand, telling him that his actions exemplified the highest traditions of military service. The citation would describe the engagement in formal language, mentioning courage and initiative and devotion to duty. It would note that Funk's actions had saved the lives of his men and prevented a German counterattack that could have jeopardized the entire company position. It would not mention the sound, or the smell, or the way Funk's hands shook for an hour afterward when the adrenaline wore off, and the weight of what he had done settled into his chest. The Medal of Honor is the highest military decoration awarded by the United States, established during the Civil War, presented only for acts of valor above and beyond the call of duty in combat against an enemy force. The criteria are specific and demanding. The act must involve personal bravery or self-sacrifice so conspicuous that it clearly distinguishes the individual above comrades. It must involve risk of life. It must be performed in the face of danger, with no opportunity for personal gain. There must be incontestable proof, witnessed by at least 2 people, with no margin for doubt or exaggeration. Fewer than 4,000 medals of honor have been awarded in American history. 94 went to members of the 82nd Airborne Division during World War II. Leonard Funk was one of them. But Funk did not think of himself as a hero. He thought of himself as a first sergeant who had done his job. In the days and weeks after Holzheim, he continued to lead Company C through the final months of the war. They pushed east across Germany, fighting through the Ruhr, crossing the Elbe, reaching the point where American and Soviet forces met and the Reich collapsed. Funk was there for all of it, 7 months of continuous combat from Normandy to the end, longer than most soldiers could sustain without breaking. He survived because he was competent, because he made good decisions under pressure, because he was lucky. Mostly he was lucky. Thousands of men equally brave, equally skilled, equally determined did not make it home. Funk did, and that fact carried its own weight. After the war, Funk returned to the United States and went to work for the Veterans Administration. It was a deliberate choice, a recognition that the country would be processing millions of returning soldiers, many of them damaged physically or psychologically, all of them needing help transitioning back to civilian life. Funk spent 3 decades with the Veterans Administration, working in hospitals and benefits offices, processing claims, coordinating care, helping men navigate the bureaucracy that stood between them and the services they had earned. It was quiet work, administrative work, the kind of work that does not generate headlines or awards or dramatic stories. It was also essential work, the work of rebuilding a generation that had been shattered by war. The irony is that history remembers Funk for 45 seconds in a Belgian farmhouse and largely forgets the 30 years he spent helping other veterans survive the aftermath of combat. The 45 seconds made him a legend. The 30 years made him valuable. Both mattered, but in different ways to different people, for different reasons. Funk understood that. He did not talk much about Holzheim unless asked, and even then he kept his answers factual, unembellished, focused on the tactical situation rather than the emotions. He did not need to relive it. He had lived it once, and that was enough. Leonard Funk died on September 20, 1992, in Williamsport, Maryland, at the age of 76. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, Section 7A, Site 192, a quiet spot among thousands of other graves marking soldiers who had served and died and been honored by a nation that tries imperfectly to remember them. His headstone lists his name, his rank, his dates of birth and death, and the Medal of Honor. It does not mention Company C or the 82nd Airborne or Holzheim. It does not need to. The people who know, know. The people who do not know cannot be told in the space allowed on government marble. What makes Funk's story worth remembering is not the violence. Violence is common in war. What makes it worth remembering is the decision that preceded the violence, the moment when Funk stood in that courtyard and chose not to surrender. That decision was tactical, not emotional. It was based on assessment of terrain, weapon capabilities, enemy disposition, probable outcomes. Funk did not decide to fight because he was angry or because he wanted to be a hero. He decided to fight because he calculated that fighting gave Company C a better chance of holding Holzheim than surrendering did. He was right, but he could easily have been wrong. If the Germans had reacted faster, if his first burst had missed, if one of the 80 soldiers had been slightly more alert, Funk would have died in that courtyard, and Company C would have lost the village, and the history books would record it as a tragic example of poor judgment under pressure. The margin between heroism and disaster is often invisibly thin. Funk's story is not unique in that sense. Every combat action involves split-second decisions made with incomplete information under extreme stress. Most of those decisions work out or they do not, and the soldier lives or dies and the war continues. Occasionally, a decision becomes something more, becomes a teaching moment, becomes doctrine, becomes a story told to new generations of soldiers as an example of what is possible when training and experience and courage intersect at exactly the right moment. Funk's 45 seconds became that kind of story. The United States Army now teaches the Holzheim engagement in its leadership courses, analyzing the tactical situation, discussing alternative decisions Funk could have made, asking students to consider what they would do in that courtyard with 80 armed men and no support. The lesson is not that soldiers should refuse to surrender. Surrender is often the correct choice when further resistance is pointless and would only result in needless death. The lesson is that soldiers should assess each situation on its own merits, consider the broader tactical context, and make the decision that best serves their unit's mission. Funk's mission was to hold Holzheim. Surrender would have meant losing Holzheim. Therefore, surrender was not an option. The logic is clean, almost mathematical. The execution required 7 months of combat experience and physical courage that most people will never be asked to demonstrate. There is another lesson embedded in Funk's story, one that has nothing to do with tactics or weapons or military doctrine. It is the lesson of scale. Funk was 5'5". He weighed 130 pounds. He was older than most of the men he led. He came from a steel town where he had not been strong enough to work the mills. He was, by every conventional measure of physical dominance, outmatched by the soldiers he fought against. And yet he won, repeatedly, for 7 months, culminating in that 45-second engagement where the mathematics seemed impossible. He won because physical size does not determine outcome in combat. Decision-making determines outcome. Speed of thought, accuracy of assessment, willingness to act decisively when hesitation means death. These are the qualities that matter. Modern militaries understand this now in ways they did not before World War II. The romanticization of the large soldier, the physically imposing fighter, has given way to a more nuanced appreciation for cognitive speed, adaptability, technical skill. Special operations forces prioritize these qualities explicitly, selecting soldiers who can process information quickly, make decisions under pressure, and execute complex tasks in chaotic environments. Funk would fit perfectly in that world. In 1945, he was an outlier. Today, he would be typical of elite units that understand war is primarily a mental game played with physical tools. The Thompson submachine gun that Funk carried is now a museum piece, replaced by more modern weapons with better range and accuracy and reliability. But the principles that made the Thompson effective in Funk's hands remain relevant. Close quarters combat still requires weapons that deliver maximum firepower in minimum time. Room clearing still requires controlled bursts, not sustained fire. Reloading still requires muscle memory that overrides panic. The technology changes, but the fundamentals do not. Funk's weapon handling in that courtyard, the speed of his reloads, the discipline of his burst control, these would be recognized and approved by any modern infantry instructor. He was, in that sense, timeless. A soldier doing soldier things with the tools available, doing them well, doing them under pressure, doing them because the mission required it. The broader context of the Battle of the Bulge is important for understanding what Funk's actions meant strategically. The German offensive failed. By late January, when Funk fought at Holzheim, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Germans had shot their bolt, exhausted their reserves, and accomplished nothing except to delay the inevitable by a few weeks. But local actions still mattered. Every village retaken was one less position the Germans could use to delay the Allied advance. Every prisoner secured was one less soldier who could fight in the defense of Germany. Funk's fight in that farmhouse was tactically significant even if it did not change the strategic picture. Company C held Holzheim. The advance continued. The war ended 4 months later. The human cost of World War II is almost incomprehensible. 70 million people died worldwide. 16 million Americans served in the military. 405,000 did not come home. The 82nd Airborne Division suffered casualties in proportion that would be unacceptable by modern standards. Entire battalions reduced to company strength, companies reduced to platoons, platoons reduced to squads. Funk survived all of it, not because he was special but because he was competent and lucky. Most veterans understand that distinction. The ones who talk about their service usually focus on the men who did not make it, the friends who died, the soldiers who should have received medals but did not because there were no survivors to witness what they did. Funk was one of those veterans. He honored his medal, but he honored his dead more. There is a tendency in military storytelling to focus on individual heroes at the expense of collective effort. This is understandable. Stories need protagonists. Audiences want characters they can root for. But the reality of combat is that individual heroism exists within systems, within units, within chains of command that make heroism possible or impossible, depending on how they function. Funk could not have fought at Holzheim if Company C had not taken the village first. He could not have survived 7 months of combat if the logistics system had not supplied him with ammunition and food and medical care. He could not have received the Medal of Honor if officers had not witnessed and documented and recommended him for the award. His story is individual, but it is not isolated. It is part of a larger story of a division, an army, a nation at war. The question of what defines a meaningful life after war is complicated. Some veterans struggle with it for decades, unable to reconcile the intensity of combat with the mundane reality of civilian existence. Some find purpose in family, others in work, others in service to other veterans. Funk chose service. He spent more time helping veterans adjust to peace than he had spent fighting in war. That choice suggests something about his character, about what he valued, about what he thought mattered. The 45 seconds made him famous. The 30 years made him whole. If you are watching this, you have now spent 30 minutes learning about a man who fought for 45 seconds in a farmhouse in Belgium, and then spent the rest of his life trying to help other people survive what he survived. The gap between those two things, between the violence and the healing, between the war and the peace, is the gap that defines a generation. Leonard Funk crossed that gap successfully. He did not pretend the war did not happen. He did not pretend it defined everything about him. He integrated it, accepted it, moved forward with it, and became someone who could look back at Holzheim and see it for what it was, a moment of violence in service of a larger mission, necessary in context but not something to be celebrated for its own sake. So here is the question worth considering. If you were in that courtyard, surrounded, outgunned, staring at inevitable capture or death, what would you do? Would you calculate the odds the way Funk did? Would you choose to fight even when logic said you should surrender? Would you trust your training, your weapon, your judgment enough to commit to action knowing you might be wrong? Most of us will never be asked to answer that question in reality. We can consider it in theory, imagine ourselves in that moment, wonder if we would measure up. But the truth is we do not know, and we cannot know until we are tested. Funk was tested and he passed. That is worth honoring. If this story meant something to you, consider subscribing to this channel. There are thousands of stories like Funk's, men and women who did extraordinary things in terrible circumstances, and then returned to ordinary lives, whose heroism is documented but not widely known. We are trying to tell those stories in a way that honors the complexity of combat and the humanity of the people who fight. If you appreciate that effort, leave a comment. Share what you think makes a life meaningful after war. Tell us what you would want to remember if you were Leonard Funk, looking back at 76 years, 45 seconds of which changed everything. And thank you for spending this time with the memory of a 5'5" paratrooper who understood that courage is not the absence of fear, but the calculation that something else matters more.